but they flip it. As you saw from the NTSB release on Friday, they reviewed the videotape, and somebody comes to the back of the duck boat, and there is a conversation about putting the water portion first. It is clear that they knew severe weather was coming, and they tried to beat the storm by going on water first, rather than refunding the $40 that each of these people paid, putting their lives at risk, and lives that they would ultimately lose on a decision that those victims never had a chance to participate in. I have heard the excuse that this was a unexpected, sudden weather emergency. No, it wasn't. It was a predicted thunderstorm, and any mariner who was out on the water has to know that severe weather can approach at any time from anywhere. And that's why when you go out on that water, that vessel has to be safe in all conditions. And this was not. Duck boats are sinking coffins. Once they take on water, they sink, and they sink fast. The canopy itself prevents people with normal flotation. Your body itself is going to float up even without, at least a little bit, without a life preserver. According to people who were on board, who we spoke to, and according to the NTSB review of the tapes, passengers were told, don't worry about putting on the life preservers when they first hit the water, even though they knew a storm was coming. And then, as the storm began to rise up, just as it was predicted, they lowered the plastic curtains and closed the lid on the coffin. Now, if it sank, with tons of seawater pouring in from the sides, in the dark, without a life preserver, even to hold on if somehow you could get out that window, you are now trapped. And drowning is a horrible way to die, because there are two competing things going on inside your brain. The higher part of your brain is saying, you can't breathe, you're underwater, you can't breathe, you can't take a breath. If you take a breath, you're drowned. But the more instinctive part of our bodies, in the lower part of the brain, is sending the message, breathe, 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 breathe. And you're underwater, and ultimately, that instinctive urge wins out. And you breathe in seawater, and you know you are drowning in the dark, and you will never see your loved ones again. And it is a horrific, unimaginable way to die. Our thoughts and prayers go out to those families. So we filed this complaint, lay out these facts, because this family doesn't want another family to go through the horror, despair, heartache that they have. And so we have brought this to bring it to light. We hope that anybody who would think to go on a duck boat would think twice and not get on, because of this family's courage to step forward and say, we'll lead the fight. We want duck boats banned. I know that Branson is a town founded on tourism, whose economy is dependent on tourism. And I have been asked, you have said that duck boats should be banned. What about the effect on tourism? Well, the Branson duck boats are owned by Ripley's. And believe it or not, you don't promote tourism by killing tourists. I'll now turn this over to my partner, Drew.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Duffy. It is disturbing and heartbreaking that we are standing in front of you on yet another duck boat disaster. Everybody in this room is familiar with the quote that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Well, the duck boat industry learned. There was a clear document out there from the National Safety Transportation Board. They learned. And unfortunately, they took a reckless approach and did absolutely nothing to correct the well-documented safety deficiencies of duck boats and their fatal design. And it was their paying customers who were doomed from the duck boat industry's cavalier attitude of it's never going to happen to us. Yeah, it happened in another city, but we have better safety protocol in our city, when the bottom line is every duck boat that went out there had minimal buoyancy, had the NTSB screaming for reserve buoyancy, which means that once it fills up with water and reaches a flooded condition, that it can still stay afloat, and of course, screaming for the removal of the canopies. It would be one thing if we were all standing in this room today and learning about, for the first time, the fatal design flaws of duck boats. But it is an absolute disgrace that those fatal designs were in a very public way pointed out over 16 years ago. And the duck boat industry did nothing, and that is outrageous. Let's be clear about this. The NTSB report that was finally issued in 2002 did not have any gray area. I'll quote from it. It says that canopies represent an unacceptable risk to passenger safety. Canopies are, quote unquote, major safety risks. Canopies on duck boats trap passengers. It is absolutely outrageous that 17 people were killed on a duck boat when the entire industry was well aware of the fatal design flaws in it. Now, apparently the duck boat industry has a history of ignoring warnings. As Bob Mongaluzzi said, let's call it like it is. This was not in any way a storm that came out of nowhere. At 6:32, there was a firm warning issued for severe thunderstorms, including the 60-mile-an-hour winds, including a specific mention of Table Rock Lake. And for Ripley's to come out and say this was a sudden storm is simply outrageous. The duck boat industry had 16 years to fix the safety deficiencies that they were warned about with these canopies and with the buoyancy. And Ripley's had over 30 minutes to make sure that they didn't expose these passengers to the approaching severe weather conditions. And the fact that they didn't do either is absolutely unconscionable and disturbing. Thank you.
And this is our partner, Jeff Goodman, is going to talk a little bit about the family.
Last week, I had the privilege of spending several days with such a remarkably strong and courageous family, and I wanted to discuss them briefly. This complaint was filed on behalf of Irving. Everyone called him Uncle Ray. He was on the boat with his brother, whom he actually lived with, Butch, as well as Butch's wife, Tony. Those are Horace and Belinda, their legal names. Irving was an avid churchgoer. Most Sundays he'd be the first one there for services. Also, obviously passing away, who we've also filed on behalf of, is Maxwell, just 2 years old, who died with his mother, Angie. Their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins who we have met with are united in an effort to ban these duck boats so that no other family has to live through the horrors that they are living through now, and so that no one else's loved ones die in such horrific fashion. Thank you.
And also with us is Greg Ailshire, and he is a local lawyer, and we are combining our forces to represent this family as best we can. And we're open for questions.
You mentioned the families that you're representing, but obviously that does not, everybody drowned is not included. Do you anticipate that other families might join this lawsuit, or have they reached out to you at this point?
Well, I think Jeff could talk about the Rose Coleman family.
Sure. Obviously, to file a lawsuit in Missouri, there's different paperwork that has to be gone through. We have also been asked to represent the estates of Butch, Tony, and Angie. Paperwork has been processed with, or I should say has been filed with the court to get those estates open, and we're expecting lawsuits to be coming shortly once the final paperwork goes through for those.
So there'll be additional lawsuits?
Yes.
Yes.
What do you guys know about the qualifications of the captain, and what qualifications he would have needed he or she would have needed to be on the water?
I can't tell you what the local qualifications were. Our expectation is that he would have had to have been a licensed captain, but how do I put this? My dog has a license, but once he got it, it didn't make him any smarter. The issue isn't licensing. The issue is knowledge and information and complying with rules. And these duck boats, regardless of the proficiency of the captain, are deadly, sinking death traps that you can't get out of. But this is the second, if you include Philadelphia, and this one, where the captain never instructed the passengers to put their life preserver on timely. One, can we go back to the other picture here?
Life
Yeah. I mean, what? Yeah, life preserver. Yeah, that one. Jeff, in your left hand. Sure. And it's pretty striking when you look at the life preservers projecting out through the top of the windows into the roof. By all accounts, not a single passenger had a life preserver on and was never told to put a life preserver on.
It's my understanding from reading that 1999 accident, the NTSB report came out in 2002, they actually recommended against wearing life preservers with boats that have canopies.
Yeah, I mean, that clarifies and crystallizes the deadly hazard of duck boats. If you put your life preserver on, it may pull you up into the canopy and drown you. And if you don't put your life preserver on and you're 40 feet down in the water running out of air, you're not going to get to the surface.
How do the other people get out, do you know?
There is some reference that we read that someone tore a portion of the canopy open, and some people were able to escape up over the top. And I think Jeff may have a little more info on that.
We've spoken to several survivors as well who have indicated that one of them tore part of the canopy and that is how some of them got out. Others indicated they frankly don't know how they got out. At just one point, suddenly they're not in the boat anymore as it's going underwater. It was so dark, they couldn't see where they were. They didn't know which way was up, which way was down, which way is left, and which way is right. So some of them, frankly, don't know how they got out, which is the same thing we saw in Philadelphia, that many of the survivors had no idea. They just fortunately found their way to the surface.
Are these folks going to sue as well? I mean, obviously they're not wrongful death suits, but could they also sue the survivors?
Anyone who was on board that vessel would have a potential lawsuit that could be filed, any of the passengers on board.
But remember, if there was, I just want to say this, if there is no canopy, and the captain says, put on your life preserver, and that boat sinks, then the boat goes down, and you stay up, and you're alive. And that is the deadly, lethal, defective nature of duck boats, which they were told about in 2002. The very hazard that killed these people, they were warned about, told about, and did nothing about. That is the horror of this tragedy. It's not something that we're figuring out for the first time. They made a conscious, intentional decision not to remove the canopies. And the only reason why that I can surmise is money and profit.
The company has said publicly that they would offer to pay various funeral expenses, things of that nature. Do you know if that offer was actually made to your clients? And if it was made to your clients, did it come with any conditions attached, like waiver of liability, anything of that nature?
I'll answer it this way. If a company in an industry put your loved ones in a coffin, would you want that company to pay for the coffin that your family member is going to be in for eternity? I don't think so.
I want to ask you again about that 2002 NTSB report, because one of the things they said that they felt that there was not proper oversight from the U.S. Coast Guard, and all of these boats have to go through certificates of inspection. In fact, this one had been through several. One, recently, I guess, most recently was maybe this past February, something along those lines. Now, I would assume that probably you can't sue the Coast Guard because of sovereign immunity or something, but they have culpability in having this industry be what it is.
Duck boats have fallen through the cracks of governmental regulation. They're not a motor vehicle, and they're not really a boat. They typically build off 1940 chassis, so they don't have to comply on the vehicle side with modern motor vehicle national transportation safety regulations. They are inspected by the Coast Guard, but they're inspected for, do they have life preservers and things like that. Nobody has legislated on the fatal flaw of canopies, which the NTSB pointed out in 2002, 16 years ago. So you can inspect a defective, deadly, and dangerous thing and say, okay, it's got enough life preservers, you know, the ones that won't help anybody if you're actually sinking. So there has been certainly a huge gap in regulation. But let's be clear. We could go through the debate from either side of the political spectrum about whether there should be more or less regulation regarding businesses and companies and business practices. But the primary responsibility lies with the duck boat industry, because they're the ones who are profiting on it. And since they have not responded to the NTSB, in my view, the only thing that will change them will be a massive jury verdict with punitive damages, so they have an economic incentive to make them safe. And until that happens, I believe they're going to continue to put people at risk of killing and drowning them.
Would you get that $100 million figure?
You know, as trial lawyers, we're using our best experience It is an art, not a science, but ultimately it's going to be up to a jury to decide what the value of this case is, and it's going to be up to a judge to decide whether we've made out a case of reckless conduct that would allow an award of punitive damages, and then a jury to decide whether that would be warranted.
Do we have a guess at
Do you have
that
any
point?
impact on any criminal charges that could come down?
Certainly in the Philadelphia duck boat disaster, the captain of the barge, not the duck boat, but the barge that ran over the duck boat, was criminally charged. I'm not going to comment on this case, but certainly the conduct of taking that out when you know canopies trap and drown people into an approaching storm is conduct that certainly somebody should be looking at.
You know,
Most
the company,
lawsuits get settled. Are you saying today that, as you said repeatedly, you want the industry done away with? You're asking for an unconditional surrender. Would that be part of any settlement here, or are you prepared to go to trial and wipe out the industry?
Our family has asked us to file this lawsuit because they want duck boats to be banned in their current configuration. We put man on the moon 50 years ago. I imagine if the duck boat industry spent the money and the R&D, they could design a duck boat that could safely be on land and water. They don't have it now. By the way, I want to go to the land side because I haven't discussed this, and I think it's important because when we're talking about duck boats, they not only kill on the water, they kill on the land. So, run over a pedestrian in Philadelphia. Why? Because they have a huge bow in front of it. Think about a bus driver. A bus driver's got the glass right here, great visibility. You have like a 6 or 7 foot bow in front of you. You're elevated. There's a huge blind spot. In Boston, the year after they killed Liz Carnicki in Philadelphia and ran her over in a crosswalk, they ran over and killed a girl who was stopped at a red light sitting on the back of a scooter because they didn't see her. In Seattle, 5 visiting exchange students were killed. Why? Because the duck boat steering linkage broke, and it hit a bus. Bus was coming this way, and when it broke, it hit it perpendicular. Well, here's the problem. In an intersectional collision, unlike our cars, which have flat bumpers, you now have basically an armor-piercing spear that is above the level of the metal of the bus or a car, which is then going to crash through the window, killing the occupants inside. Imagine if every car in the United States and truck had a spear in the front of it, so that every time you were in an intersectional collision, a perpendicular collision, it would now intrude into that operator and passenger compartment. So these things are lethal, both on land and on water, and it's time for them to go.
you know if the company is insured?
I cannot tell you how much insurance Ripley's has, but considering that it is a huge entertainment conglomerate and that its parent company has revenue of $10 billion a year, which is the parent company, Pattison, the largest single employer in Canada, from what I understand, and has $10 billion in revenue, I would imagine that they would have sufficient insurance or sufficient assets to cover any judgment.
I want to be clear on this one more time, sir. You said it's time for these things to go, but in answer to my question, you said, well, maybe they could be remodeled or reconfigured. Which is it?
Well, the ones that are currently on the road should be banned. They should be banned. If they want to do research and development, and they could develop a duck boat that could safely go on land, doesn't have blind spots, doesn't have an armor-piercing spear, has no canopy, and could go out in the water and has reserve buoyancy so that nobody drowns, then yes, I wouldn't oppose it just because it's a duck boat if it was safe. We oppose these because they are lethal, and they not only can kill people, they have killed people, and 42 is enough.
Can you clarify the corporate lineage of Ride the Ducks? They're bought by Ripley's in 2017, but the Seattle operation was carved out of that. Is that correct?
I'm going to turn to my two more knowledgeable partners on the corporate history, if I can.
It is our understanding, so Ride the Ducks International was what all of the various Ride the Ducks entities were consolidated under sometime around 2006. When Hershen bought it out, that's the Hershen Family Entertainment Corporation. That included the Philadelphia operations, the Branson operations, the Seattle operations. It is our understanding that in December of 2017, Ripley's purchased only the Branson operation, and thus the Ride the Ducks International Group basically divested themselves of the Branson operations, but otherwise continues to operate. Part of the Ride the Ducks International is also Amphibious Vehicle Manufacturing, Inc., which was the actual company initially involved in the designing and fabrication of these vehicles.
There's been some legal filings in the Seattle case that suggest that Robert McDowell had no engineering, no mechanical background as he designed many of these ducks over the years. Do you know if anybody else ever got involved in the manufacturing of these ducks who did have engineering, mechanical backgrounds?
We're aware of the utter lack of knowledge exhibited by Mr. McDowell, who was one of, if not the central figure in retrofitting these wartime vehicles for tourist operations. Who else exactly was involved in the process? We've certainly deposed people from their team before, but there's not any other main person that we're aware of. I don't know whether some of the other operations in other areas have different people involved.
In the depositions you guys have done, was the question posed to any of the Ride the Ducks personnel about why aren't you guys heeding these NTSB recommendations? And if they did respond, what was their response to that question?
During the depositions, tens if not hundreds of thousands of questions were posed, and we were certainly extremely critical of the failure of them to follow the recommendations. The essential, I couldn't quote from the responses to you now, but the essential theme was no one has ever told us these vehicles are illegal. There's no regulation banning them. We believe they're safe, was essentially the theme of their responses.
Given what has happened in the past year, I would sort of broadly address this, and obviously there's a history here. Do you believe, given what happened in Philadelphia as well, that this is going to be settled? I mean, this doesn't sound like this is going to go to court. Highly unlikely.
Our goal right now and our mission from the family is to find out what happened and to make sure it never happens again. And that is all we are focused on. There's been no discussion of settling the case. There's been no discussion of money with the family at all. They have given us two things to do, and two things only. Find out what happened, make sure it never happens again. And we are united with the family that is all we are focusing on right now.
Have the defendants been served?
I'm sorry?
Have the defendants been served?
I would doubt that very highly because we filed last night.
There was talking about the fatal accidents, but what about non-fatal injuries over the years? Do you have statistics on that?
Yeah, I can't give you the statistics on it, but there have certainly been injuries caused, particularly in land-based accidents with Ride the Ducks vehicles.
There were some people who indicated they had ridden the duck boats earlier in the day, that one of them was pulled out of circulation for mechanical issues, and some had questioned whether or not this particular boat that sunk was the one that had mechanical problems earlier in the day. Do you know anything about that?
That's the first I'm hearing of that, so that I don't know. Obviously, there was an inspector who did an inspection a year earlier who was critical of their exhaust coming out below water line, with the fear that in turbulent water that could go back up inside and knock the engine out, where if there is a Higgins bilge pump, that would cause the bilge to cease operating. So I don't know enough about whether that actually happened. Obviously, the NTSB tape review indicates that the bilge alarm had sounded at least twice. So we know that that vessel was taken on water, and that based on the alarm that the bilge pump was operational. Obviously, it wasn't able to prevent the boat from being swamped and from sinking. And that lack of buoyancy is something that the NTSB addressed and warned the duck boat industry about 16 years ago. And rather than do anything about it, they just continued to sell tickets and expose their passengers to death.
What about the emergency latch fees that apparently exist to lower the windows, or what, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So certainly from our earlier case, we know that there is an emergency latch that could be used to drop the windows immediately. Certainly if the boat is sinking, the last thing on earth you want are those windows to be closed, because between the canopy, which traps them, and the windows, which traps them, you are basically closing the coffin shut as it sinks and drowns them.
Did you know if it was activated in this case?
The NTSB report indicates that the windows were closed. Some of the post-salvage photos certainly show that at least one side of those windows are still, I would say, closed. And I believe, and I think Jeff has spoken to a couple of the survivors, so I'll let you report on what they said about the windows.
All the indications we have is that the captain closed the side curtains and that at no point was any kind of deployment latch used so that they would be released, and that they remained on as a confining the passengers.
Do you know if that's true of the canopy as well? We've heard that maybe he pulled this pin that could have released it. There's some confusion about that too.
We don't have any knowledge that there is a pin that could have released the canopy.
Isn't it true that really no boats should have been out in the weather that happened? I mean, obviously we talked about the kind of situation with the duck boats, but I mean, certainly it could have posed a danger to anybody in any vessel given the weather conditions, correct?
Well, my partner, Mr. Duffy, was in the Navy, so I'm going to let him answer that one.
In Norfolk, Virginia, one of the Navy's largest naval bases, one of the single most important things that happens day in, day out is weather monitoring. We've all heard of the term small craft advisories. We all heard from Mr. Pattison say that these vessels should not have been out on the water that day. There is no excuse for these duck boats to have been out of the water when they had such a stern warning. Your local meteorologist, from what I was reading, came across as incensed when it was first recommended that this storm came out of nowhere. They said, no. There was adequate warning given. And there wasn't only adequate warning given, we specifically noted the 60-mile-an-hour winds, and we specifically noted Table Rock Lake. So what more do you need to say, okay, we're going to make the decision here, that's the right decision, the safe decision, and we're not going to take the chance of sending these duck boats out on the water, especially with what they should know about the duck boats and their buoyancy. But
in addition to obviously all of our fine meteorologists, have they contracted with any independent company to provide weather monitoring services or had their own radar to detect storms as they were approaching the area?
we do not know that yet, but their weather monitoring practices will be at the forefront of our questioning.
What about some of the survivors? You said you talked to some of them. Did they check any of their weather apps or have any idea on their own that this may not be a good idea to get on this boat?
They were told by Ripley's, that they were switching the order of the tour because there was some weather coming. They certainly didn't have any indication through Ripley's or through themselves that it was going to be so tragic. It's not their job to monitor the weathers. That's Ripley's.
In general, what kinds of safety information or warnings do tourists receive before they go on the ride?
Before they enter the water, the captain gives a brief safety overview, essentially identifying adult life preservers here, children life preservers here, and there's some type of brief safety overview.
Have you spoken to any of Branson officials, Mayor Karen Best or anybody there regarding this lawsuit and what it could potentially do to Branson in the future in terms of tourism?
No, we have not. But certainly this tragedy, as a result of the reckless indifference by the duck boat industry, wasn't helpful to Branson's tourism. As I said before, you don't promote tourism by killing tourists. And so I think Branson should join us in banning these duck boats. It left a black mark on that great community, an entertainment capital, a tourist mecca, and that town's reputation should not be soiled because of the reckless decisions of the duck boat industry.
I have another question. Springfield lawyer, we both live in the same town. Why are you part of this team? Can you explain that?
These gentlemen asked me to get involved. As you indicated, I'm local. I live in Springfield. I practice in Springfield. I grew up in Springfield. I grew up around the lake. I go to the lake often. I'm very familiar with it and very familiar with the community as a whole. And so based upon an interview by these gentlemen, they decided to go forward with me to be their local counsel and be a part of their team, and I'm honored to be a part of this team.
As a practical matter, you mentioned about getting rid of the duck boats or banning them. Your lawsuit can't do that. That's got to be something that either federal regulators do or the independent business has to do on its own.
Yeah, I agree with you. But juries can send messages, and they can send strong and powerful messages. And if government won't step in to act, we have the jury system, which can speak loudly and clearly about what they think about the duck boat industry. And I think that we will prove out a claim of punitive damages. I think we will prove the reckless conduct, and I believe ultimately a jury will decide that they deserve an award of punitive damages against them, to not only punish them for their conduct, which is one of the goals of punitive damages, but to deter others from doing the same thing.
Would you consider it as part of the settlement that the police came in and said we're going to ban these as part of the deal?
Certainly, I think our clients are interested in that first and foremost.
You mentioned that family contacted you and reached out to your firm based on your history. Are they paying you, or is this a pro bono situation?
No, we have, as you know, personal injury lawyers generally work on a contingent fee, so they do not pay us unless we're successful.
40%?
It's not 40%, but I will, as it's an attorney-client privilege, but I can guarantee you it is not 40%.
I have what may be a last question communicated to me for any of the attorneys at the podium, and that is, can you briefly explain next steps now that the matter has been filed?
I'm going to turn that over to Drew.
Well, the obvious next step is we will serve all defendants. After we serve all defendants, we'll file that. We'll get a notice from the federal court. The federal court will call us in for initial conferencing. At initial conferencing, there will be a timeline set for discovery. Discovery, as everybody knows, is the process where we can get all of their documents and start taking depositions of the people who we want to depose.
And that'll be here in the Western District of Missouri Federal Court, right?
Correct. Correct.
Has it been assigned for mediation?
It has not yet, but we anticipate that. And let me add to this, because there were questions about how a lawsuit may not be able in and of itself to ban the duck boats. I applaud the leadership and actions of the two Missouri U.S. senators. Senator McCaskill especially has done an outstanding job and shown great leadership in stepping to the forefront on this very issue and speaking on the Senate floor, and has made statements that she will make sure she enacts or introduces legislation to try to make the duck boat industry adopt the safety policy and procedures that the NTSB recommended over 16 years ago. What you will hear from the duck boat industry, if they are ever opposed with a direct order to make changes on their buoyancy and their canopy is that they have to completely redesign the vessel, and therefore that is not economically feasible for them. And so we are extremely happy that somebody of Senator McCaskill's stature has stepped up to the plate and joined our battle against these duck boats, because it is somebody like her and the attention she's paying to it that will yield a substantial change.
Is there a last question? If not, we thank you very, very much. Please make sure, if I don't have your contact info, before you leave, and you will leave before we leave. We're going to stay around here in case there are any afterthoughts, after questions you have. Thank you very, very much. Did you have a final question? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Yep. You have it. They are. They are.
Yeah, Jeff's going to take it.